The evening air in Millbrook, Virginia carried the faint smell of pine and cut grass, the kind of quiet suburban stillness that made residents feel like nothing bad could ever happen here. It was a Wednesday in late October, just past 7 in the evening, and the streets were nearly empty except for the amber glow of streetlights and the occasional sweep of headlights from passing cars. In the driveway of a handsome brick colonial on Evergreen Lane, a man and his wife were loading luggage into the trunk of a dark blue Lexus sedan. They moved with the easy rhythm of a couple who had done this 100 times before: 2 rolling bags, a garment bag, a leather briefcase. They were headed to Atlanta for a weekend event, a keynote address the husband had been invited to deliver. They were not in a hurry, they were not doing anything unusual. They were, by every visible measure, just 2 people living their lives. His name was Marcus Webb, 47 years old. 6'2", broad-shouldered, with close-cropped silver at his temples and the kind of calm eyes that had seen the inside of courtrooms, boardrooms, and legislative chambers for over 2 decades. He wore a charcoal gray sweater and dark slacks, a gold wedding band, nothing that announced who he was. That was in many ways exactly the point. Her name was Diane Webb, 44 years old, a professor of constitutional law at Howard University. She wore a burgundy coat and natural hair pinned back with a gold clip. She was on the phone with her department chair, reviewing notes for a paper she was co-authoring, even as she helped load the car. She was the kind of woman who could hold 5 conversations at once and remember every word of each one. They had been married for 19 years. They had 2 children, a son in his 2nd year at the University of Michigan and a daughter in 10th grade who was visiting her grandmother for the week. They lived well. They worked hard. They paid their taxes. They shoveled their neighbor's driveway in the winter without being asked. They were, in every sense that the word means something, upstanding members of their community. None of that mattered when the police cruiser pulled up to the curb. Officer Calloway had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 6 years. He was 31 years old, sandy-haired, with a thick neck and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from experience but from authority. He had joined the force right out of the military, and somewhere in that transition, he had never quite let go of the assumption that every situation was a threat assessment. His colleagues described him as assertive. His supervisors called him passionate. 3 formal complaints had been filed against him in 6 years, 2 for excessive verbal aggression and 1 for an unlawful vehicle search. None had resulted in disciplinary action. He had been cruising the neighborhood for routine patrol when he saw the Lexus. Later, he would say he had received a call about suspicious activity in the area. There was no such call logged in dispatch records. What there was, in the dashcam footage that would later become central to everything, was Officer Calloway slowing down well before the house, watching the couple for nearly 40 seconds, and then pulling to a stop directly in front of their driveway with his lights activated. Marcus saw the lights first. He straightened from closing the trunk, turned to look, and felt the familiar settling, not of fear exactly, but of bracing. The particular kind of quiet preparation that black men in America learn before they even learn long division. He set his face into something neutral. He kept his hands visible. He did not sigh out loud, though the sigh lived somewhere in his chest. Diane ended her phone call. Officer Calloway stepped out of the cruiser with one hand resting near his belt. He walked up the driveway without greeting them. He looked at the car. He looked at the luggage. He looked at Marcus with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite contempt but lived in the uncomfortable territory between the two. "Good evening," Marcus said. His voice was even, practiced in its evenness. "What's going on here?" Calloway said, not a greeting, not an introduction, a demand. "We're loading our car," Marcus said. "We're leaving for a trip in the morning." "This your house?" "Yes, it is." Marcus gestured toward the front door. "We've lived here for 11 years. Calloway didn't acknowledge that. He looked at the Lexus again. "Can I see your license and registration?" "May I ask what this is about?" Marcus said, still calm, still measured. "I got a report of suspicious activity in the area." Calloway's jaw tightened slightly. "Your license and registration." Marcus looked at him for a moment, then he said, "Of course." He turned to go inside to get his wallet because it was in his jacket hanging by the front door, and that was when Calloway stepped forward. Hey, where are you going?" "To get my wallet," Marcus said, turning back. "It's inside." "You don't go inside," Calloway said. "You stay right here." Diane, standing on the other side of the car, spoke for the first time. "He just told you his wallet is in the house. He lives here." Calloway turned to look at her as if she had said something incomprehensible. "Ma'am, I'm not talking to you right now." "You're talking to my husband," she said, "and I'm his wife and we both live here, so I think that makes this relevant." Something shifted in Calloway's face. Not anger exactly. irritation at being addressed by someone who, in his internal accounting of the situation, had not been given permission to speak. "Both of you need to calm down," he said. Neither of them had raised their voices. Neither of them had moved in a manner that could be described as threatening. Neither of them had done anything except ask reasonable questions. But that was the word Calloway chose: calm down. What followed over the next 12 minutes would later be described, in multiple independent reviews, as a textbook example of pretextual enforcement. Calloway radioed for backup, citing an uncooperative situation. He told Marcus to place his hands on the hood of the car. He told Diane to move to the sidewalk. He ran the Lexus plates and found, predictably, that the vehicle belonged to Marcus Webb, registered at 14 Evergreen Lane, Millbrook, Virginia. The car was not stolen. There were no outstanding warrants. There was no criminal history. None of this information prompted Calloway to change course. When the backup arrived, a younger officer named Torres, who looked genuinely uncertain about what he was being called to, Calloway was in the middle of telling Marcus that he had the right to detain him for the purposes of investigating suspicious activity. Marcus, who held a law degree from Yale and had spent the better part of his professional life working in the legal system, recognized immediately that this was not how the law worked. He said so, quietly and precisely. "You don't have reasonable articulable suspicion of a specific crime," Marcus said. "Running plate checks on a vehicle parked in its own driveway in response to a vague report with no specifics does not meet the Terry standard." Calloway stared at him. "Are you a lawyer?" "I am," Marcus said simply. "Then you should know better than to obstruct a police investigation." "I'm not obstructing anything," Marcus said. "I'm standing in my driveway. I told you the wallet is inside. I've answered your questions. I've been cooperative." Calloway took a step closer. He was not a small man, and he used his size in the way some men do when words stop working, as punctuation. "I'm going to ask you one more time to put your hands on the vehicle." "They're already visible," Marcus said, holding both hands slightly out from his sides. "I'd like to understand what the legal basis is for this stop." From the sidewalk, Diane had her phone out. She was filming. Calloway noticed. His eyes went to the phone, then back to Marcus. "Put the phone down," he said to Diane. "I have the right to film a police interaction in a public space," she said. "Commonwealth of Virginia does not require consent for recording in public." She was correct. Calloway knew she was correct. That was perhaps the most infuriating part from his perspective, not that they were arguing, but that they were right. And they were doing it without raising their voices, without drama, with the kind of precise, informed calmness that somehow felt to him more adversarial than shouting would have. Officer Torres stood a few feet back, hands at his sides, looking at the house, then at the car, then at his partner, and finding nothing in any of those directions that justified what he was witnessing. Calloway made a decision then, the kind of decision that people make when they are more interested in winning an argument than in doing the right thing. He told Marcus he was being detained for investigation. He told him to place his hands behind his back. He reached for his handcuffs. Marcus Webb did not resist. He did not argue further. He put his hands behind his back and let the handcuffs click into place, and the expression on his face was one that Torres would later describe in his statement as the most dignified thing I've ever seen. Diane stopped filming only long enough to make a phone call. 2 calls, actually. The first was to their family attorney. The second was to a number she had memorized, not because she ever thought she would need to use it this way, but because she was a woman who prepared for contingencies. The second call went to the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Virginia Governor's Office. It took 23 minutes from Diane's second phone call for the situation on Evergreen Lane to change completely. During those 23 minutes, Marcus Webb sat on the curb of his own driveway with his hands cuffed behind his back. He did not speak unless spoken to. He did not cry. He did not rage. He watched his neighborhood from ground level. The Hendersons' porch light across the street, the elm tree whose roots had been lifting the sidewalk for 3 years. The basketball hoop in the Parkers' driveway where his son had spent 1,000 summer hours. And he felt the particular weight of a man who has been through this before in some form, who knows how this story goes. And who has spent 20 years building a life that should make him exempt from it, only to discover once again that no life makes you exempt. A third cruiser arrived, then a dark SUV with government plates. Then, pulling up to the curb with a quiet authority that immediately changed the atmosphere of the scene, a black town car bearing the seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia. The man who stepped out of the town car was Harold Simmons, Chief of Staff to Governor Patricia Langley. He was 60 years old, white-haired, with the bearing of someone who had managed crises for decades and found most of them less impressive up close. He walked directly to Calloway, who had been standing near his cruiser with his arms crossed. "Are you the officer in charge of this scene?" Simmons asked. "Yes, sir," Calloway said. He had straightened instinctively. Something in Simmons's presence demanded it. "Do you know who that man is?" Simmons said, nodding toward Marcus on the curb. Calloway glanced over. "He says he's a lawyer." "He's being uncooperative." "That," Simmons said, "is Marcus Webb. He is the Attorney General-designate of the Commonwealth of Virginia. He was confirmed by the General Assembly 11 days ago. He is scheduled to be sworn in on Monday morning." Simmons paused, letting each sentence land with the weight it deserved. "He is sitting on the curb of his own home in handcuffs." The silence that followed was not like regular silence. It had texture, it had temperature. Officer Torres later said he heard a sound from Calloway that he could only describe as a deflation. Not a gasp, exactly, but the sound a man makes when the ground he thought he was standing on turns out to be air. Calloway looked at Marcus on the curb. Then at Simmons, then at the town car with the state seal, then back at Marcus. His face went through a series of expressions that would have been almost comical if the situation were not what it was: disbelief, recalculation, something that was trying to be professional composure and not quite finding its footing. I wasn't aware." "Remove the handcuffs," Simmons said. His voice had not risen a single register. It didn't need to. Torres moved before Calloway did. He walked to Marcus, crouched slightly, and removed the handcuffs with a care that felt almost apologetic. Marcus stood, rolled his shoulders once, and turned to face the assembled officers and officials with the same expression he'd worn throughout: contained, precise, aware. Diane was beside him immediately. Not frantic. She touched his arm once, briefly, the way people do when they want to confirm that someone is real and whole. Marcus covered her hand with his for a moment, then let it go. Simmons extended his hand. "Marcus, I'm sorry you had to go through this." "Thank you for coming, Harold," Marcus said. His voice was steady. He shook the hand. Calloway had taken 2 steps back. He was watching this exchange, watching the handshake, watching the ease with which Marcus Webb and Harold Simmons spoke to each other. Watching the town car driver straighten his tie, watching the third cruiser officer scroll through something on his phone, and then look up with an expression of wide-eyed alarm that told Calloway the officer had just looked up who Marcus Webb was. The weight of the evening was settling now, and it was settling on Calloway alone. He tried once more to salvage something. "Sir," he said to Marcus, "I was responding to a call." "There was no call," Marcus said quietly. "I know how dispatch logs work. I've been reading them for 22 years. He looked at Calloway with an expression that was not anger and was not contempt. It was something harder to name: exhaustion mixed with purpose. "You stopped us because we were black and loading a car in a neighborhood you decided we didn't belong in. You escalated because we knew our rights and you weren't used to that. You handcuffed me because I wouldn't perform deference for you." He paused. "None of that is a call." Calloway had no answer. Torres was looking at his shoes. The third officer had put his phone away and was staring at the elm tree. Simmons stepped in. "Officer, your sergeant will be in contact tomorrow morning. I'd suggest you have your body cam footage and dash cam footage ready for review." He said it the way a person says something when the outcome is already known and the formality is just a courtesy. Calloway nodded. He got in his cruiser. He drove away. Torres remained for a moment. He looked at Marcus. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. It was not the policy-speak apology of a department covering itself. It was the kind that comes from a person who knows they witnessed something wrong and did not stop it quickly enough. Marcus looked at him for a moment. "Learn from it," he said. Torres nodded. He got in his cruiser and drove away. The story broke the next day, not because Marcus Webb called a press conference or issued a statement. He didn't, not at first. What broke it open was Diane's video, which she had uploaded to a private cloud account while the handcuffs were still on her husband's wrists, and which she shared with a journalist she trusted. Not to start a firestorm, she would later say, but because she had learned a long time ago that documentation is not revenge, it's survival. The video ran 4 minutes and 17 seconds. It showed a calm, well-dressed couple being questioned on their own driveway. It showed Calloway's escalation. It showed the handcuffing of a man who had done nothing but ask questions. It did not show the arrival of Harold Simmons, because Diane had lowered the camera by then. She would say later that she simply hadn't thought of it, that in the moment her attention was entirely on her husband. The video reached 2 million views in 18 hours. By the time Marcus Webb was seated at his desk in the Attorney General's offices on Capitol Square in Richmond, 3 days ahead of his official swearing-in, because certain situations require a man to show up early, his phone had not stopped ringing since before sunrise. He did not take most of the calls. He took the ones that mattered. Governor Patricia Langley called at 7:15 in the morning. She expressed what she called her profound outrage, and then she did something more than express it. She asked Marcus what he needed. and she meant it in the operational sense, the sense of a person with power asking another person with power how they intended to use theirs. He told her, the Millbrook Police Department issued a statement by 10 a.m. that described the incident as under review and noted that Officer Calloway had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. It was the kind of statement that said everything by saying almost nothing. The police chief, a man named Gerald Weston who had survived 4 mayors and 3 police reform initiatives, had been in office long enough to know when a statement was a holding action and when it was an ending. This one, he knew, was an ending. At noon, Marcus held a brief press availability outside the AG's building. He was flanked by Diane and their family attorney, a sharp-suited woman named Patricia Howell who had been practicing civil rights law in Virginia for 30 years. He spoke for 7 minutes without notes. He said that what happened on his driveway was not unusual. That was the part of his statement that cut through everything else, not the confirmation of his title, not the description of the humiliation, the simple, quietly devastating observation that what had happened to him was not unusual, that it happened to black men and women across the country who did not have law degrees, who did not know Harold Simmons, whose names would never appear in a headline, who would sit on the curb of their own driveways or stand on the sidewalk of their own streets and endure it in silence because the alternative was something worse. I am standing here today, he said, not because what happened to me was exceptional, but because my position makes it possible for me to say something about it in a place where it might be heard, and I intend to say it. He paused. He looked directly at the cameras. This office, he said, will take seriously every single complaint filed against law enforcement officers in this Commonwealth. Everyone, not the ones that make the news, not the ones involving people with titles, everyone. The clip of those final seconds was the one that played on a loop for the rest of the week. It would be easy and perhaps satisfying to write Derek Calloway as a villain. The dashcam footage made it simple to cast him that way. But the fuller story was more complicated and more instructive. Calloway grew up in Harrisonburg, the middle child of 3, in a household where authority was synonymous with righteousness and questioning authority was synonymous with disrespect. His father had been a deputy sheriff for 22 years. His uncle had been a corrections officer. The uniform in his family was not just a job, it was an inheritance. It was a way of ordering the world. He had not joined the force to harm people. He would have been honestly bewildered if you told him that harm was possible from a place of sincere belief in order. He had stopped the Webbs in his own mind because something had not looked right. He could not have articulated what exactly. In the honest middle of the night, if he had allowed himself the question, he might have admitted that what had not looked right was 2 black people in an expensive car in front of a house that he, in some wordless calculus, had decided they were unlikely to own. He had not invented that calculus. He had inherited it, absorbed it, breathed it in from an atmosphere of assumption that surrounds some people so completely that they cannot smell it. This does not make what he did right. It does not make it less harmful. But it is part of the truth, and the truth matters here. Because the truth is that systems produce Derek Calloway the way water produces fish, not through any single act of creation, but through the ongoing conditions of the environment. In the weeks that followed, Calloway retained an attorney. He gave a statement in which he stood by his decision to investigate the scene and acknowledged, in careful legal language, that his use of restraints may have been, and here was the precise phrase his attorney had chosen, procedurally premature. He did not apologize. He could not find in himself the architecture for that apology, not yet, perhaps not ever. That is its own kind of tragedy. The internal investigation took 8 weeks. It found that Calloway had violated department policy on use of restraints in a nonviolent encounter, had failed to document a valid basis for the stop in his incident report, and had not followed proper de-escalation protocols. The previous 3 complaints against him were re-examined. A pattern was identified. His termination was recommended and approved. He was 31 years old. He had 6 years on the force. He had thought he was doing his job. What people missed in the weeks of coverage and commentary was what Diane said privately in an interview with a documentary filmmaker 3 months after the incident, an interview that would later become part of a film about racial profiling in suburban communities. She said that the hardest part was not the handcuffs. The hardest part was that it was a Wednesday, a regular Wednesday. They were loading a car. She had been talking to her department chair about a footnote in a legal brief. Marcus had been thinking about the speech he was going to give in Atlanta. It was the kind of evening that a life is mostly made of, undramatic, functional, ordinary. And it had been interrupted not by something extraordinary, but by something so ordinary in its own right that she had known, the moment the lights came on, exactly how the next hour would go. "I've been through versions of this my whole life," she said in the interview. Not the handcuffs, but the rest of it, the stop, the questions, the having to prove, the tone, the feeling of someone deciding who you are before you open your mouth. She was quiet for a moment. "You don't get used to it. People say you get used to it. You don't. You just get better at surviving it without it showing." Their son Elijah called from Ann Arbor the night the video went viral. He had seen it before they could tell him about it. He was 20 years old and studying political science, and he called his father and said, "Dad, I can't believe." And Marcus heard the break in his son's voice and said quietly, "I know, I'm okay, I promise." They stayed on the phone for an hour. Marcus told his son about the elm tree and the Parkers' basketball hoop, about the way the neighborhood had looked from the curb. He told him about Torres removing the handcuffs with care. He told him about Simmons arriving. He told him about the silence after the truth arrived. "Are you angry?" Elijah asked. Marcus thought about it for a real moment, not the political answer, the true one. "Yes," he said, "but the anger is something I've had for a long time. What I feel most right now is purpose. Like something that was already there got sharpened." Elijah was quiet. "Then, what are you going to do with it?" "My job," Marcus said. 14 weeks after the incident on Evergreen Lane, the Office of the Virginia Attorney General released a comprehensive directive that would become known informally as the Webb Guidelines. It was 43 pages long and covered in precise legal language the standards for pretextual stops, the documentation requirements for any investigative detention, the protocols for review of complaints against law enforcement, and the establishment of an independent civilian review panel with subpoena power, the first such panel in the Commonwealth's history. Marcus had written much of the core framework himself in longhand on yellow legal pads at his kitchen table on early mornings before the house was awake. Diane had read every draft. Their family attorney had reviewed the legal precision. 3 civil rights scholars, including 2 of Diane's colleagues at Howard, had provided consultation. The directive was not perfect. Law is never perfect. It was challenged immediately by 3 police unions and 2 county sheriff's associations. It went through 2 legislative hearings and emerged modified but intact. It became, in the legal community, a model for how an executive directive could create accountability structures without waiting for legislation that might never come. In the first year after its implementation, complaints against law enforcement officers in Virginia increased by 41%. This was not, as some critics argued, evidence that policing had gotten worse. It was evidence that people had started to believe that complaining might actually accomplish something. That distinction mattered enormously. Substantiated findings against officers increased by 22%. Wrongful stop lawsuits against Virginia municipalities decreased by 17% in the following 18 months. The numbers told a story, and the story was that accountability systematically applied works, not perfectly, not completely, not as fast as it should, but it works. There was a moment, not widely reported, that occurred the morning after the incident, before the video broke, before the press calls, before the tide of the story became something larger than any single evening in October. Marcus woke at 5:15, which was his habit, and sat in the kitchen in the dark with a cup of coffee and thought. He thought about every moment in his life that rhymed with the previous evening. The time he was followed through a department store in Chicago at 19, his first year of college, wearing a Yale sweatshirt. The time a taxi passed him on 7th Avenue in Manhattan in 1999, a decade before smartphones made the evidence of such things visible. The time he was questioned at a hotel check-in counter in Nashville about whether his reservation was actually under his name, while the white man behind him waited and watched. The time his son, at 15, was stopped on a bike near their neighborhood and asked where he lived, and Elijah had given the address, and the officer had asked again, as if the first answer couldn't possibly be correct. These were not the worst things that had ever happened to black men in America. He knew that with a clarity that made them heavier, not lighter. The worst things were the things that didn't end at a driveway. The worst things were the things that didn't end at all. But these were his things. The accumulated catalog of being perceived as a problem in spaces where he had every right to exist. And here he was, 47 years old, the Attorney General-designate of the Commonwealth of Virginia, having spent his career building the very systems that were supposed to prevent exactly what had happened to him on his own driveway last night. He sat with that for a long time. Then he finished his coffee, went upstairs, put on a suit, and went to his office. Not because the work had saved him from the experience. It had not because success had purchased him exemption. It had not done that either. But because the work was real, and it mattered, and the experience had not broken him, it had refined him, the way pressure refines certain materials into something harder and more precise than they were before. He was not naive enough to think that one policy directive would fix a system that had been built brick by brick over centuries. He was not young enough to believe that justice was inevitable. But he was experienced enough and honest enough and had sat on enough curbs in enough metaphorical and literal ways to understand that the direction of movement matters even when the destination is far. You move, you document, you build, you hold the line. And sometimes, in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday, when the world decides to remind you of exactly who it thinks you are, you stand up from the curb, you straighten your jacket, and you go back to work. The Webbs made it to Atlanta, though they went on Thursday instead of Wednesday. Marcus gave his keynote address to a ballroom of 1,200 people, on the subject of equal justice under law, what it means, where it falls short, and what the work of closing that gap actually looks like day to day, policy by policy, case by case. He did not mention Evergreen Lane in the speech. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room had seen the video. He stood at the podium and spoke for 40 minutes about systems and accountability and the long, non-linear, frequently discouraging project of making the law mean what it says. He spoke about the people whose names no one knows, the ones who sit on curbs and are never uncuffed by a chief of staff, who don't have a title that changes the temperature of the room, who are simply people living their lives. And deserving of dignity not because of what they've earned, but because of what they are. The applause at the end lasted a long time. Diane sat in the front row and watched her husband stand at that podium and receive that applause, and she thought about the conversation she'd had with her department chair on the phone the previous Wednesday, while she was loading the car, about a footnote in a legal brief. The footnote was about the principle of equal protection under the law, the idea, written into the 14th Amendment, that no state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. She had been discussing, on the phone, whether the footnote needed to be expanded, whether the point it was making was clear enough, whether a reader coming to the material without context would fully understand what was at stake. She thought that by the time the evening was over she had her answer. The footnote needed to be expanded, the point was not yet clear enough. The reader without context, the reader who had not sat on a curb in their own driveway, who had not watched someone they love be handcuffed for asking reasonable questions, who had not felt the particular texture of that silence, might not yet fully understand what was at stake. That was why you kept writing. That was why you kept working. That was why Marcus Webb walked into his office on a Monday morning and got sworn in as Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Virginia, with his wife standing beside him and his son watching on a phone from a dorm room in Ann Arbor, and his daughter watching from her grandmother's living room. And why he raised his hand and said the oath and meant every single word of it, not because the system was good, but because it could be better, and because someone had to be the one to make it so. And he had learned, on a curb on Evergreen Lane on an ordinary Wednesday in October, that he was prepared to be exactly that someone.